Today's the day that we make our 2022 rankings list. Ranking the season out, ranking the drivers out. Let's get into it. Decided to do it a little bit differently than other people. I'm ranking the first half of the season, second half of the season, and giving them an overall. Then obviously putting them as a rank. So P whatever they are, out of the 20 drivers that have competed. Decided to keep Hülkenberg and De Vries out of the list because they've only raced in two races. 2 races for Hulk and 1 for De Vries, so they don't really need to count for it, but we do have everybody else. So let's get started with P20. Now, obviously, this spot only goes to one person, the actual GOAT himself. For the first half of the season, I had him at a 1 out of 10 because a 0 is impossible. I think you competing gives you a 1, and if he was competing, it was only himself. He was terrible and genuinely had just such a bad start to the season. The second half, I only give him a 0.5 because Japan was an okay performance. I mean, it was lucky. He kind of had that fortune of just, screw it, let's put on the intermediates, let's see what happens. And that's what happened. But he kept up. He kept up and he did decent. So a 1.25 overall, P20 for Latifi. Now, at P19, this kills to put him here, but Riccardo had such a terrible season. The first 2 or 3 races, Riccardo started off really well, and giving him a 2.5 I feel like is harsh, but it was only like the first couple of races. Bahrain, he did beat Norris, but the car wasn't anywhere near it. I don't think they cared what the positions were there. Now Saudi, before he retired, because of the car issue, he was beating Norris and was doing genuinely well. Imola could have been a lot better of a performance. That's it though. That is where the Riccardo performances lay off. Second half of the season, Singapore was decent, and Japan almost could have been decent. Wasn't, but Singapore was decent, and we had a good performance from him in Mexico. Mexico was the track that he actually really performed, and that's why I'm able to give him a 2.5. 2.5 overall, P19. Sucks to have Riccardo have this bad of a season. P18, we got Yuki Tsunoda. Ended up having a 4 out of 10 in the first half, a 3.5 in the second half, and an overall of 3.75. Now, Yuki improved from last year. Don't get me wrong, Yuki improved, but not by much. And he's still making rookie mistakes, especially like Singapore. Like Singapore, you have Canada, then you have Silverstone where he crashed into Pierre Gasly. I mean, like, as an F1 driver, you can't afford to be making mistakes like that, and Yuki is still making those mistakes. While I do think there's a lot of potential, he is still far behind. P17, I have his teammate, Pierre Gasly. Now, a 4 out of 10 in the first half. This is mainly because of Baku, and he did what he could in other tracks. He tried extracting the performance. He had a decent opener. They did DNF, but he was doing well, and he was in the points. I can't exactly recall what happened in Saudi, but I'm pretty sure that he did not. He probably did score points. I can't remember. I do remember that he was awesome in Baku and really performed the car when he needed to. He outqualified Yuki this year, considering he really didn't like the car. He still outqualified him. He still beat him in race head-to-heads and almost had double the points. So I have to put him above Yuki, but both have had tragic years and honestly kind of the same. They've just been bad. It's not really been a good season for AlphaTauri, but not for the drivers as well. At P16, I have Mick Schumacher. Now, Mick turned the season around. The first half of the season was atrocious. He had almost no point scorings. He ended up scoring in Silverstone. That was his first, and that is technically still considered part of the first half of the season, so that is why I give it a 2 out of 10. But every other race was bad and was not good by him. He wasn't competing. The car was at a good level at that time. He needed to compete at that time. He can't have crashes. Like, he didn't even compete in Saudi. Saudi, he wasn't even in the race. And Monaco was just, he was so far behind, he didn't need to crash and just make an unnecessary error like that. So, it sucks to have Mick out of the sport. I feel like he could have been a lot better, but we're not going to be able to get that out of Mick now. We won't get that fire in him anymore because now he'll have to come back. Maybe we'll see fire for him to make his way back in. And I put for the second half of the season 6.5 because genuinely he was beating Magnussen. He did what he could do with the car. Considering his terrible qualifying in Brazil, he brought it back the car. Mexico, he did what he could do. Monza, he tried doing what he could do. Like, he was constantly close to the points. I wish this could have been better for him, but It just wasn't. It just wasn't. And for that reason, it's 4.25 for him and P16. At P15, I have the Rookie of the Year. The only rookie. Zhao himself, Guan Yu Zhou. Zhou, Zhao. I think it's Guan Yu Zhou. That's what he said to call him, so that's what I'm sticking with. First half of the season, I gave him a 3 out of 10. This is mainly for the factor of the car was actually really good, and while the car was really good, he wasn't performing to the best of his performances. But he did DNF in performances that he probably would have scored points in, so at that point, it's not fair to evaluate him like that. But every other race that he was racing in, he wasn't racing to the best of his ability. He is a rookie, so a 3 is fair. But the second half, though, he was a man on the mission. He did really well. The car wasn't there to perform to get points when it needed to, but he outqualified Bottas in the second half of the season, was constantly above him in most races, was almost finishing the points in plenty of races. Even in Abu Dhabi, he almost scored points. He had that nasty overtake on Albon, so I give it a 7 out of 10. Guan Yu was good, and genuinely should be proud of the rookie season that he's had. I'm excited to see what he's going to do next year with a car that he finally knows for 2 years. P14, I got the man Stroll. Stroll. Now, Stroll started the season off bad. Vettel came in, second race he raced in, automatically scored points. Stroll couldn't do that. He did score points in that race, but that was 10th. Vettel was 8th. He scored less points, but it wasn't too bad. But from then on, he wasn't scoring points. He was constantly out of them. Performances like Baku really put his season down because Vettel scored a P6 while he scored a DNF and P16 the whole entire race. So for that reason, I had to give him a bad first half of the season. But then the second half, qualifying improved, race pace improved. He was a lot better. Genuinely had like a completely different two tails, kind of like Guan Yu Zhou, and stepped on it. He stepped on it when he needed to and did exactly what he needed to do. And for that, I gotta praise Stroll because his qualifying pace was better and he was keeping up with Vettel. There's some of the teammates on the field with the closest qualifying gap. So for Stroll to be even that close to Vettel, it's impressive. And I give him a 5.25 overall, ranking P14. Magnussen, another tale of two halves at P13. This one's opposite of Stroll and Guan Yu Zhou. First half of the season was great when the car was performing. Magnussen did what he could do. Now, I gave him an 8 out of 10 because when the car was there, he did his best to get it there. It wasn't like Mick, who was struggling to get the car to those places. He was genuinely just doing it. When they could compete, he competed. Bahrain being your perfect example. Now, second half of the season, sure, he did get a pole position, but he got beat by Mick most of the season. When it came either to the race or qualifying, he was getting destroyed by Mick. Mexico and even Abu Dhabi are like the perfect examples. Mick spun, and Magnussen was still nowhere to be seen. So I don't know if it was a car problem or not, but K-Mag still had a decent year. I will not say it's bad. It's obviously better than Mick's. And a P13 is solid with a 5.75 overall. Valtteri Bottas, the Batman. 8 out of 10, 3.5, 5.75 overall. Don't really need to explain this one. I mean, if you've watched the season, you know that Bottas had an awesome beginning, had an awesome performance in Miami, had an awesome performance in Imola, had only really like a couple of mistakes, so that's why it's an 8 out of 10. It's very hard to get a 10 out of 10, might I add. That's a perfect season. Nobody's gotten that except for one person. 8 out of 10 is solid for the first half of the season because he was really doing what he could do with that car and really outperformed it. Second half of the season, he struggled. When the car was out of the points, he felt like he was also down on himself, and terrible qualifying performances, terrible race performances, couldn't really get to grips of how he wanted to perform with the car. The only exception was Mexico. That was a great performance, and Brazil was good too. He really tried there, and that's kind of what puts him up to 3.5. Otherwise, this could have been even lower. P12 for Valtteri Bottas. At P11, I have Alex Albon. Now, this is the first person to actually get like a solid score, and actually there was somebody else, but I'm forgetting. At P11, Alex Albon, first half 6, second half 6. I think he did what he could do with the car. He did have mistakes though. Like when it came to point scoring, he did what he could do. Whenever he was there to score, whenever he had the opportunity, he did it. Whenever he needed to score, he did score. Spa being the performance in the second half that I can specifically think of on the top of my mind. Miami and Australia being the other performances where he scored. When he could do it, he did do it. So for that, I give props to Alex, but there were mistakes. Monaco was atrocious. Spain was atrocious. A couple of Singapore. But I mean, Singapore is hard to judge. The dude literally had appendicitis surgery, so I don't know. Like, it's a very hard season to judge, but I'm happy for him. He's back. He killed his teammate and genuinely did really good. I mean, like, a very overall good season for Alex Albon, and proud of him for being back because I genuinely love Alex, and I hope that he continues to further himself, and I hope that Williams has a better car next year. 2023 better be a good year for Williams. I am manifesting it. Ocon. Now, this might be a shock to some people, but he is at P10. I honestly think Ocon's year has been overrated. People keep saying that he's like the underrated driver of the year, that he's like really improved. Yeah, he has. He's been competing with Fernando, and for that, I give him props. But let's be real here. Would Ocon be ahead of Fernando in the points table? No. If there were other cars that were performing just as good as that Alpine, like let's say Vettel had the Alpine, Vettel would have made a lot more points in this car than Ocon did. When Fernando was performing and wasn't DNFing, he was always higher than Ocon. He destroyed him in race head-to-heads and qualifying head-to-heads. Ocon was consistent, and for that I have to have him at P10 because to me, he felt like he was the median of the group. It wasn't necessarily the greatest, wasn't necessarily the worst, he's just kind of stuck in the middle. And for that, that's why I have Ocon at P10, and debate me if you want, but I think a 6.5 is a very fair judgment for Ocon, and that's just kind of how I felt like his season went. P9, another shocker. Now these are the ones, I think from P9 to P1, everybody here had a good season, I would say, or better. Perez being the worst of those because I genuinely think that that first half of the season was killer. He had a pole position, he kept up with Max, he fought in Spain, he fought in Baku. He was doing well. He was doing extremely well with the car that he was given, and was competing with Max. That was exactly what they needed him to do, to be close with Max, to be within the fight, and that's where Perez was. When the second half came, and as soon as Canada came and he crashed that car, I feel like that's where the season just kind of fell off for Perez, and we didn't really see Perez perform like Perez should be performing. And that's why I give him a 7.5 out of 10. The only real performance we had was really Singapore, where he really did excel in his performance, but I don't think he would have been close to Max if it wasn't for Max having that problem in qualifying and team kind of throwing him. At P8, we have Carlos Sainz. Yes, he is P8, and that is sad to say because I love Carlos. I think that Carlos can do a lot better than he did this year. I think that the first half of the season was not good for him. He was crashing. The joke of the year was that he was in a gravel trap consistently. So yeah, gravel trap Sainz for first half of the season. Second half of the season though, big improvement. Barely any pace problems. Race pace was great. He was really close to Leclerc in qualifying pace and was performing as well as you could ask him to perform in the Ferrari that kind of fell off a cliff by the end of the season. The tires were getting gashed, so from what you could expect, Sainz was doing exactly that. He had his mistakes, of course, like Japan being one of them, but yet again, an 8.75 out of 10, that's solid, and an overall 7.66 out of 10. P8. Now, we got the man, the myth, the legend, Vettel himself. Now they're retired. But first half, 7.5. Second half, 9.5. Overall, 8.5. Let's talk about it. First half was a 7.5. He came back from COVID. You couldn't really expect the world from this guy. And he crashed in Australia. That was a bad performance. Austria wasn't his greatest performance, but while the car was down on qualifying pace, he always came back in the race. And for that, I'm giving him 7.5 because he did what he could do. Baku was an insane performance with that new car. Monaco got into Q3 with the car that he just met last weekend. So it's like, it's hard to really judge and say like, oh, this was a bad half season. I wouldn't say that. I thought it was a pretty solid half of the season, but then the second half came in, I'm giving it a 9.5 out of 10. He was flawless here. The second half of the season, since Spa, was flawless for Vettel. The only reason why I gave him a 0.5 was the crash that he had in the beginning of Japan. That is it. When the car was performing, so was he. 2 P6s, had a couple of P8s, had a P10 at the very end of the season. He scored in more than half the races this year in that piece of garbage. That thing is literally, like I said, I've used this metaphor before, it is a recycling bin with wheels. So what do you expect from Vettel for most of the season, but when it was performing, like the second half, as soon as Aston worked on their car, out of that back cheeky wing, you already know Vettel was there to perform in an 8.5. This is a solid season for Vettel to genuinely be happy with himself, and I'm glad that he finished off on a high. P6, crikey mate, Russell. Now, Russell had an amazing start to the season and did what Mercedes was really asking him to do. Now, why I'm not giving this a 10 is because it wasn't perfect. He had his screw-ups. He had Silverstone. He was performing with the car, but like, to me, what really showed it was when the car was in the optimal level and we saw Lewis blazing with that car, he wasn't there to perform like Lewis was. And that's kind of why I'm giving it a 9 out of 10, and especially this 8.5 out of 10 that I gave as well. That is because the second half of the season, he had stupid crashes, he made mistakes, and he kind of fell off from the beginning of where he was at. An 8.75 overall is a fair assessment, I think, for Russell, and it's a very good season for him at first, and I genuinely think it's only going to get better. They are the closest teammates in the fields, so we'll see how this steps up. Now, here's his teammate, Hamilton. Hamilton is up there at P5. These are the top 5 now. 8.5 in the first half season. He was testing the car, had problems, wasn't going as planned, but Spain comes around, he's back in it. Since Spain, this guy was flying, but I got to give it an 8.5 because of performances like him a lot. And that, regardless whether you test the car or not, you shouldn't have been behind Pierre Gasly for the whole race. I just genuinely believe that was such a bad performance, and that's not a Lewis Hamilton type performance. He got lapped by Max, so I mean, like, that tells you one thing. But other than that, second half of the season, almost flawless. If it wasn't for that Singapore performance, that was not a good performance by him either. So an overall 9 out of 10, and I expect him to be back with a 10 next year. At least in the first or second half. I genuinely believe Lewis is about to be so feisty next year, and it's going to be great. P4, we have Alonso, the guy that I hope has the best next year. And this year, I hope that his reliability problems next year are gone, because I wish we would have seen this guy with no reliability problems. First half of the season, only bad performance was Australia. Everything else went to plan, and however he could have worked with the car, so 9 out of 10. Second half, same thing. Whenever he could perform, he did really well. There weren't really any races that he was kind of like lacking in performance. The car usually just kind of let him down. So for that reason, I have him at a 9 out of 10 overall. Had an amazing season, and I'm excited to see one of the top 3 drivers on the grid kill it next year. P3, we have Mr. Number 7, Lando Norris himself. Yes, Lando had a killer first half, had a killer second half, and overall just did amazing. I mean, this guy must have solidified himself as P7 on the grid, because that was all he was getting, because he was best of the rest. He just recently said in an interview he hates that, and I don't blame him. I would be pissed to be called best of the rest as well too, but he doesn't have really an option at this point. McLaren was best of the rest, and well, they weren't. Alpine was, but he made the best of what he could do. And for that, I give Norris props. He killed it this season. He had a couple of bad performances, like Miami and Saudi. To me, was bad because Riccardo was ahead of him for most of this race if it wasn't for the DNF. So give him a 9 out of 10 there. And 9.5 out of 10 for second half. He did what he could do. Brazil was his only kind of like screw up. So yeah, P3 for Norris. Number 2, Charles Leclerc. I thought hard about whether I want Norris or Leclerc here because I've seen other people's lists, and I've seen that Norris is second in most people's lists. And I sat there and I thought to myself, I'm no fanboy of Leclerc, and I genuinely like to critique Leclerc, but what he has done with that Ferrari, in my opinion, for the second half of the season and the first half of the season has been nothing but phenomenal. His one-lap pace has been insane. He ran away with it in Australia. He ran away with it in Spain. There were multiple races if it wasn't for the DNFs. Even in Baku, when the car isn't a straight line speed monster, he was performing and doing exactly what he needed to do. Leclerc was killer. Leclerc was killer, and genuinely, what he did in Abu Dhabi, what he did in Silverstone with the hard tires to even preserve that P4 at the end, it's just like, the guy's an animal. The guy's an animal, and I grew a new love for him this season because it took a lot out of him. Genuinely, he had to fight really hard to get there, and I feel like he just did just that. I give Leclerc props, and I expect him to be up with the big boys next year, yet again, with the better car. At number 1, you expected it, Max Verstappen. He had the best year, and I think that his first half was better than the second. Now, Obviously, I said a 10 out of 10 is perfect, and I don't think the Max could have done anything better in that first half of the season. He did exactly what he needed to do to be able to compete with Leclerc. He had the worse car at some points in some other races, but was always there to maximize on those efforts. Whenever they weren't doing good, Verstappen was killing it. Whenever they needed Verstappen to step up, he stepped up. Perez could not do the same. Now, the second half of the season, I gave him a 9.75 out of 10. Now, why is this? Singapore. That is the race that, like, really solidified to me that, like, it wasn't his best race. That race was awful to watch as a Verstappen fan, and I didn't think it was good. And I think that Brazil was the same thing. Both those races were, like, complacent races from Verstappen, and he wasn't patient, and that's kind of what cost him at the end to give him that 9.86. But this season will go down in history as a Max Verstappen domination, and congrats to the that's my 20 drivers ranked. You guys let me know what you guys had, and give me your 20 rankings. I'd really like to know. Please leave a like, subscribe. It would mean the world, and peace.